Welcome to the last week of our summer session. This is week 6, and I have put everything that we need up on Catalyst. So today's maybe going to be a short video depending on what kind of tangents I go on this week. So I'm super excited. I put a little piece here about how I feel about the end of class. I have been observing everybody's progress and all the work, and I've been really impressed. Summer is always difficult, no matter what subject you're learning, or in my case, teaching, because of the very condensed amount of time that we have available to focus on the information. And the subject of environmental studies is so broad that we could talk forever about it, and I could continue to educate you all on the subject. It's obvious that there's an abundance of information to learn in this area, or I wouldn't have all of my degrees in the subject. And that in itself is a relatively new thing, actually. For a long time, as you may recall from the video, Fierce Green Fire, environmentalism didn't really arise until the 60s. So there were not specific programs in colleges and universities in environmental studies. So a lot of times when you see people working in environmental studies, environmental sciences, they come from other subjects. I'd say my program at UC Santa Barbara was probably one of the first. It came out of the oil spill of 1969 that occurred in Santa Barbara. So let's see if it says here, UC Santa Barbara Environmental Studies Program. And let's see, it doesn't have anything on their history. So there was an oil spill in Santa Barbara in, there it is, 1969. Something we're, I think, more familiar with these days, but also something you're going to see a little bit more about today. Not necessarily or specifically the Santa Barbara situation, but other oil spills. And there are oil spills that happen on land with the trail derailments. There are oil spills that happen in the water. There are big oil spills. There are small oil spills. You're going to be looking at the aftermath of a very large oil spill that happened in our country. So, like I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of historical programs in environmental studies. So when I was going through my undergraduate education, a lot of my instructors were actually educated in other subjects such as biology, ecology, marine science, and then specifically in the areas of the social sciences like economics, poli-sci, sociology, anthropology, things like that. So it's a very fascinating subject in my opinion. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be doing. That is not the right week. Week 6, here we are. I once again put it into a Word document so that it was easier for me actually to put into the system. Okay, so I've broken it down like I normally do into various stages. The first thing I have for you to do here is this game on natural resources. And we've talked a lot about natural resources, specifically with regards to water and oil. But this game, the intent of this game is to help you figure out kind of a categorization of these different resources. Now, the point of this game is for you to become more affiliated with the terminology behind resources. So what I want you to do is play the game, see what score you get, see what maybe could go in different places, and try to get a higher score. And when you get the highest score that you can, then take a screenshot and submit that screenshot. So what you're going to be doing is all of your resources are listed in these tiles above, and then you're going to put them into these buckets. So if you click on the bucket, you can pick. So let's put like agricultural products there. Ocean resources. I start with the ones I think are the easiest. Forest resources. And then let's do minerals. Now, if you don't have an idea about these different things, then just go ahead and open another window and Google it and see what you can find. So agriculture, we watched Food Inc. We learned a little bit about agricultural products. So let's take a look at what in this is an agricultural product. Cotton is an agricultural product, so I'll put that there. And corn is talked a lot about in Food Inc. with regards to genetically modified. It's also talked about in Pump, where they talk about possibly using ethanol as a fuel and making ethanol out of various plant products. So let's see, agriculture. Livestock could be considered agriculture, but it could also be considered something else. Let's go ahead and put it in there and see what it says. Let's open the bucket, and it has our items listed here. Now for each of the buckets, because there's so many, you will have to submit and then add another bucket. So let's see what this says. So it gave me 3 points for each of those. So it says that that is correct to some extent. So ocean, I'm going to see, I don't know, let's see. There's fish. What else do we get from the ocean? That looks like it's about it. I'm just going to say no. 5 for fish. Awesome. And you'll notice too that that's what happens. So see how the point affiliations. So petroleum products, 4 points. That one I can do. We've got oil, possibly, if they consider it a product. We've got plastic is a petroleum product. Gasoline. Now see, coal could be considered a mineral resource. And that's where I would put it, because products would be, in my opinion, something that is the result of processing a raw material. So coal would probably be mineral, or there's this other category that they listed as raw. So put them in there. I'm going to submit. I got 12 points there. So basically this is what I want you to do. Continue adding, add to pollution, recyclable products. And you can only use each tile once. So that's the interesting thing, because some of these might be renewable products, but they also might be something else. So just go ahead and do the best that you can. And when you're done, I'm going to go ahead and hit done. I'm not done, but it's just to show you. Say yes, and it'll show you what you got right, what you, it'll tell you if you got it wrong as well. It'll tell you the points. So what I want you to do at this point, and you can just do the top here so I can see your score, is just do, depending on your computer, I have a Mac, so I can do click, screenshot, and submit that and to turn it into the appropriate folder. But play it. I gave you about a half an hour to just kind of mess around with it. It's just a fun way to get more familiar with your terminology. So let's make sure that I created the folder. Here it is. Let me also make sure that I allowed you to submit pictures, any file type. There you go. Okay. So that's the first part. The second part builds off last week. Last week I had you watch the speech by Donald Trump, and it's almost exactly the same content here, except I changed Republican to Democrat. And same thing, just free write and give me your impression of the same things you did with Donald Trump. This time we're looking at Hillary Clinton. So that's 2 hours because of the speech and compiling everything and then typing it up and submitting it. And there is a folder for that right here. Okay. And then there's 20 questions in this next section that I've called Sustainable Cities. Basically, these are various aspects of how we live our lives in society to help us kind of understand some of the things that need to be done, and don't necessarily designate whether or not a city is sustainable if they have it. For instance, we're going to look at wastewater treatment. Most major urban areas in the United States have some type of wastewater treatment. What wastewater treatment is the water that goes down your drain in your house, down your toilet. All of that water is collected into a sewer system that goes underground and is transported to a processing facility, unless you live somewhere that has a septic tank. A septic tank is different. You're not connected to the main sewer line. So the way that works is different. So this is specifically to wastewater treatment in a sewer line. And what I've done is I've created an exercise here that has you look at the very large facility in the South Bay. I've put the main web page. I would suggest watching this video. It's very short. It's like 30 seconds. Unfortunately, I could not find a video that is specifically about our wastewater facility here in the South San Francisco Bay Area. But you can Google and find the wastewater process. All facilities are fairly the same. They have different stages within the treatment process, which you'll learn about when you go through this exercise and answer the questions. So basically, just answer these questions and you can label them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you want, you can copy the questions into your new document. You don't have to. Remember that if you do copy the questions and paste them into your new document that you submit on Turnitin.com, it will show that originality score that shows overlap. But that's okay. When I see an originality score that has overlap, I go and I look and I can see specifically where the segments of text that are considered overlap are coming from. So I don't just take that number for face value and say, oh, 30%, you're going to be marked down. I actually can go in and I can see where that is coming from. And a lot of the times when students use the questions, it will show me exactly that just the questions have been copied, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is when I get an assignment that has been 100% copied, and I've had it before where it's a personal reflection, and somebody actually took a prior student from the past, copied their complete reflection, which remember is supposed to be your own personal response to whatever the exercise was. They copied it, copied and pasted it into a document and uploaded it as their own. And in that situation, there are many things that I could do as an instructor because that violates college policy. So don't worry if it's like a yellow 30% or green. You just don't want it to be 90 and above, okay? So go ahead and look at wastewater. Now there's something here I want to point out, which is I asked this question in number 5, where's the water from the streets go? And this varies in different places, but there's an assumption that the water in the street goes to these wastewater processing facilities too. In our case, it does not. That would actually create an extreme burden on the wastewater processing plant because of the amount of water that would be pushed into the facility during a heavy storm event. So the water that's in the street, the water that would be runoff in a storm event is not directed to the wastewater facility. So anything that gets in the street and goes down those drains goes into somewhere else. And what I want you all to do is to identify what that somewhere else is. A good way to do it is to just go out to the street and find a drain and see what that drain says. Most of the time it will tell you exactly where it flows. And then all on wastewater treatment. I do want to point out something else that I realized is not in any of the stuff that we've done. And that aligns with the rainwater, I'm sorry. So there are two different types of pollution. There's non-point source pollution and point source pollution. And I'm actually going to, well, they did it backwards. I'm going to start with point source because I think that is easier to understand. Let's see how they explain it. This is the EPA. This is the federal EPA. That means that it's happening at the level of Washington, D.C. The EPA is an agency that has been given the authority to oversee certain environmental regulations that have been imposed by those environmental laws, federal environmental laws, that you all started to learn about in your last forum. So the way that this works is that the EPA actually sits directly underneath the president. So if you look at an organizational chart, of the US, sometimes they come up kind of blurry. You can see that, this is a good one, but it might be blurry. We have our three branches of government that you all did an exercise on. We have the legislative branch, which is the what we call Congress, and that has the Senate and the House in it. And remember, that's designated either by population or just a number of representatives per state. Interestingly, I went on a tour of the what do you call it, the congressional buildings in Washington, D.C. last year. It was very interesting to see the differences between the Senate and the House and their chambers, and even how I got a little insight on the social interactions between the two, because I believe it's the Senate that has 2 representatives per state, and that means that for the whole state, for instance, in California, you get 2 people that have seats, and that means that they have to have a pretty good support, and they have to have pretty good momentum. I think most of those representatives tend to be from a higher socioeconomic class. They're more likely, I think, I don't have data to back this up, but I would say that they were more likely to go to a higher level university, come from a higher financial backing family, whereas the House of Representatives is based on population, so you have more in an area. And so it was very interesting to see even the dynamics between the interns that worked within the congressional building and like who's in the Senate and who's with the reps. I was actually visiting through the House of Representatives, so it might be a little bit different if I had been visiting through the Senate, and I would have been able to see maybe a different perspective. But so obviously it would be a little bit biased and skewed because of the way that I actually got in. Very interesting too, the way the whole building is set up. There's underground tunnels that take you from the various houses or the buildings where the congressional members have their offices. It reminded me a lot of Harry Potter, in that they have these different buildings that are associated with the different kind of groups of subgroups of these different divisions of Congress. So here we have the president. Currently it's President Obama. We'll see what happens in November with regards to who it'll be next. But all of this little connector, all of this sits under the President of the United States.
And it's interesting because that's a lot of work to oversee all these committees. And he has obviously a panel of his own cabinet and his own advisors that assist, and there's heads of each of these groups. But this is a very large organizational chart, and there's a lot of responsibility that sits on the shoulders of the president. If you look down here, and it's going to be very hard to see, right here is the Environmental Protection Agency. These others you're probably more familiar with because we hear about them more regularly. Notice that this box does not stem from any of these boxes, which means it's not a subdivision of these other departments, but it's other responsibilities of the president. Over here we have the judicial branch, which houses the Supreme Court of the United States. The job of the judicial branch is to ensure that the laws that are passed by the legislative and the executive branch are abiding by the U.S. Constitution. Every law that's passed in the United States, whether it be a state law or a federal law, must abide by the Constitution of the United States. So the job of the Supreme Court is to ensure that is occurring in the laws that are created by the president and the legislative branch. And this is where you'll see these very high contentious issues existing. And one of them that has recently come to light is the Citizens United versus the FEC, which I believe we took a look at. If you haven't, or if we didn't, then take a look at it. There's a story of stuff on it. Very influential in our current political process. What the outcome of that was said that corporations or businesses could basically donate as much money as they wanted to, or X amount of money. Basically, they could have large influence in our political process. A lot of people are calling for some type of action to reverse that because of this concern over private industry becoming so engrossed in our democratic process or our political process in the United States. So let's go back to the EPA. I wanted point source pollution. I'll just tell you. Point source pollution is when the pollution comes from a specific point that you can identify. Or even if you can't identify it, it would be basically you would want to identify the location if you could see that a plume, that's what this is, a plume of pollutants was occurring. You'd want to see where is it coming from. This is a point where pollution is being released. So let's see, the US EPA defines point source pollution as any single identifiable source of pollution from which pollutants are discharged, such as a pipe, ditch, ship, or factory smokestack. And in these cases, for instance, like a factory smokestack or the release of appropriate permitted pollutants into a water body, that's exactly what happens. Businesses or entities need to get permission to be able to discharge, and then it's regulated or overseen by an agency. Usually there's an inspector that comes out and checks on whether or not that has been occurring. Now, that can be problematic in times where you have oversight of funding for those inspectors or those agencies. So one of the ways to strangle the impacts of these agencies is to limit their funding. And that's the interesting thing about the EPA, is that the president gets to designate who is in charge of the EPA, but Congress gets to designate the budget. And that can be problematic. As for instance, in our Congress right now, we kind of have a stalemate with the representation not wanting to allow very much to go through. So we're kind of in a freeze where we're not able to make any progress happen. So the president, can designate, and I believe it has to be passed by the Congress, but they can put a person into the position of the executive director of the Environmental Protection Agency. However, the amount of money
that representative, I'm sorry, not a representative, that nominated official would have is designated by Congress. So if Congress overall doesn't feel strongly about carbon emissions from coal power plants, we know coal is a form of fossil fuels. When you burn it to be able to generate energy from it, it releases carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which contributes to the acceleration of the greenhouse effect, thus influencing anthropogenic or human-influenced climate change. If you have a bunch of representatives, as we've seen in some of the videos, that are in Congress that don't want to see progress being made towards regulation of coal burning power plants, then what they're going to do is they're going to try to control it through the use of the budget. So it's a very complicated, intricate process. You don't need to know every aspect of it, but a lot of you have been in your writings, in your 321s, posing questions of why doesn't the government do more, or why aren't we doing more, or why are certain individuals not supporting it, or how is it the way it is in the United States without, when we all know that our environment is in a not good position, and that it's having a negative effect on our human population as well as other species, which we depend on our Earth. So it's a very intricate and complicated process. This ties back to why voting is so important. Now, the other type of pollution is non-point source pollution. Now, non-point source pollution is more difficult to identify, like where it's coming from, because it's not coming from one specific point. So let's see what it says here. Non-point source pollution generally results from land runoff, precipitation, atmospheric deposition, drainage, seepage, or hydrologic modification. So when it rains, and I mentioned that the water in the streets does not go to the same place as the water that goes down our drain, that rainwater is the rainwater, when mixed with the hydrocarbons or the dirtiness that comes off your car engine or off your car itself from the brakes or the engine, that gets onto the concrete over time when we drive. And when it rains, all of that gets into the rainwater and it goes down those drains in our streets. That is non-point source pollution. It's kind of coming from everywhere, even though we know it's coming from the vehicles. We can't identify only one specific point. It's many different points. And the same thing here, they've got the cattle, so agricultural lands, because of the fertilizer, the herbicide, insecticide. When we did our work the other week where we looked at going into Central California, if you pull back on a Google Maps satellite image, you can see all the parcels of the farmland. If you find a polluted body of water that has been influenced by fertilizers, any of the sides, insecticides, herbicides, you won't be able to identify specifically which farm it came from necessarily, and so that's considered non-point source. It's coming from many different locations, not one specifically. Okay, so I wanted to talk about that because there is going to be a connection in the way that the wastewater is processed and where the clean water goes. So there's a discharge point in the wastewater process, and that could be considered a point source. Now, when the water from the Santa Clara, San Jose wastewater facility is released, and I'm not going to tell you where it's released, there's a difference between the water that's released in the point source versus the water in the natural body. So whenever you have a change of chemistry, temperature, anything like that that could impact the ecological system at the point of discharge, then it could be considered a pollutant. And temperature can be. So if the water coming out, and I'm not saying that it is because I don't know what the temperature of the water is where it's discharged, but if there is variation, then that can actually be a negative impact on the ecological life. in that body of water where it's being released, because the body of water may maintain a temperature within a certain range, and the organisms that exist in that body of water are able to survive within that range. If the temperature goes up or down and changes, then those species may not be able to survive. And this is very similar to what is predicted to be occurring with climate change, in that there's going to be less variation in the Earth's temperature. We're seeing warming at the warming extending beyond the equator, both north and south, moving further up into the temperate regions. We're seeing this change in latitude where this warming is occurring. So if the warming occurs and the species that have evolved over time exist in a certain range of the Earth's latitudinal zones, then what we'll see is the species that could exist in the area that was cooler, which now may be warmed because of the increase in temperature, those species may or may not be able to survive in that new adjusted climate. Now, the concern for that is, and people will say, oh, the Earth's temperature has varied over time, over the tens of thousands of years, we've had warming and cooling trends. That is true, we have. However, they have occurred on much longer time frames than we're currently seeing now. And evolution, which is the survival of the fittest, which a lot of people like to say, oh, survival of the fittest, if you can't survive, it's not gonna, that's your problem, you're not capable, you're not strong enough. But that's not necessarily the way that it works. It's not that if you can't survive, it's that if you can't survive because of changes and there's not enough time for generational turnover in the species, so that those who can survive and have the genetic composition that would allow them to survive in their new environment can reproduce, then you're going to have problems. So when we see dramatic changes in a short period of time, that does not allow all species to be able to respond in the way that they need to respond. And that's not a conscious response, it's a biological response in the way that genes are passed on and traits and characteristics are expressed in those genes, which would allow for survivability in a new environment. It's a little heavy-handed on the science, but that's kind of what goes on with climate change and any type of change in an environment, which is where the point source pollution can be problematic with regards to the example that I gave you, which is temperature. So you're going to learn about integrated waste management next. I've got some links and then questions. A lot of people don't know what goes on with the garbage, and if you did a quick search on me, you would find that this is actually my area of expertise. It's the area that I studied in my undergrad, and I actually worked in my first real environmental job. I was the recycling coordinator for the city of Santa Barbara. It was the first ever. And so we're not going heavy into the solid waste and recycling, but for those of you who might be interested, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me. This is a really good area to go into. There's good money in it, and in my opinion, there's always a need for dealing with waste, because people don't want to deal with their garbage. You want to put it out, and you want it to be taken away, and you want it to be managed, and you don't want it to be your problem. And when people don't want to do things themselves, they kind of just would rather pay to have someone else do it. So you're going to learn about integrated waste management. Got some questions. Go to this website. I really appreciate, it's a PDF, sorry. I really appreciate it when you all email me and let me know when the links aren't working or something's being weird. That's the only way that I'll know if anything isn't working correctly. And it's the only way for me to notify others of changes that they may need to know of so that they don't make the same mistakes. So it's a very community-oriented thing, and I really appreciate it when you all let me know if there's issues. So if there's issues in any of these links, because I'm not going to open all of them, just shoot me an email and I'll try to clean it up. This one's on the Sunnyvale Smart Station, which is a pretty good video on what's called a MRF, M-R-F, or a materials recovery facility. So watch it, see what you learn, and let me know, answer the questions. I put this one in, it's kind of in the middle. Didn't need to be, but just talking about sustainability. What is sustainability? This is, interestingly, it looks like a student project somewhere, but it has some good information, and it has this ego versus eco thing, which to me is very important in understanding environmental studies and a different perspective of looking at us as part of the system instead of us as humans dominating the system and being in control of the system. Information on trash in the oceans. This is just stuff that I want you guys to kind of just be aware of. Bottled water. You've already learned a lot about water, but I wanted to bring the bottled water concept closer to home in that I want you to look at a map that has where bottled water comes from in California. And what you're going to see is that there are a lot of locations in California, despite our drought conditions, where these companies are going in and bottling water. And there's a specific situation that has to do with Ethos brand. Oh man, I forgot one other thing. And there's another one, I'm going to add it in just so you guys can, oh, I can't add it in. Well, if you Google it, it's very interesting. Do Nestle bottling California, and you'll find that Nestle is actually using water from, I want to get the San Bernardino National Forest. Now remember when we did the federal lands and you learned about the variations in oversight in publicly owned lands? So here's San Bernardino National Forest. Remember, forests, national forests are not regulated like national parks. So at some point, Nestle got a permit that allowed them to pump water out of the San Bernardino National Forests to create, to sell on the market. And they're selling it for more than that. And that permit has expired, and there's been no action to stop them from taking that water. So this has been a pretty controversial subject. That Story of Stuff website, I believe, has a whole campaign committed to getting Nestle out of the San Bernardino forest, especially during a time when there's drought conditions, when the state itself is really struggling for water and water oversight. You've seen the discrepancy between agriculture and urban areas in their conservation efforts to maintain enough water in the state. And here we have a private company, Nestle, tapping into one of our natural resources and putting it on the market for a very low price to the state. And at this point, it becomes kind of looking at it from the environmental economics perspective. It's a cost benefit. Is it worth it for us to be giving this right to Nestle to take that water? Notice, just like oil, they're not pumping out the oil and giving it back to Californians. They're pumping out the water and they're taking it and selling it on the open market to whoever wants to buy it. So they're actually taking something that is within our jurisdiction and profiting off of it in sales to other people. So that's something to understand, and that's why I had you learn about the privatization of water as well as the economics behind the environment, because it's important to understand this stuff. It happens in so many different areas. And you will later on in this exercise today learn a little bit more about privatization, particularly in education. So companies that own almost everything. This is a really interesting infographic. I want you to take a look at it. Look at the brands that are on there, and you're going to list the 10 companies that own almost everything that we see in the stores. This is a 30-minute video. It's a Vice HBO, but I found it on YouTube, I believe. And it's about our use of antibiotics, where we find these antibiotics in nature, what's going on with regards to that, how that's affecting our population, and how antibiotics can be good and they can be bad. And then also palm oil. So palm oil is beginning to be, or is, a very large agricultural product. Particularly in this video, they talk about Indonesia, where they're illegally going into the forests. They're burning the forest. They're cutting the forest down. They're compromising habitat for the orangutans. And it's all so that they can produce palm oil, which is considered a vegetable oil. Now, if you take some of those products that you see in the top 10, crackers or cookies, and you should do this, take a look at the products that you have in your house. If you look at the ingredients, if it says palm oil, then they could be coming from Indonesia. What happens when the land is unregulated and this illegal operation is occurring is that they can do it for a really low price. So in the market, it means that producers can get that palm oil over, say, some other type of vegetable oil for a lower price. And that's what they want to do, because that allows them to have increased profits. So they're always trying to cut costs so their profit can go up. But the problem is that it's displacing people. The native populations don't want it there. They're not benefiting from it. It's degrading their environment locally, and it's contributing to things on a larger scale globally. So not long. I really like these Vice clips because they, in my opinion, attract to a more youthful audience. It's not so straight fact, which is a little bit more like the one I give you later on, and I apologize for that. So same thing with media. 6 companies own all the media. This ties back to why I've been kind of reinforcing this idea of look at where we're getting our information and always check multiple sources. You'll see that. You'll start to see trends. If you look at the news, you'll see that certain perspectives and opinions come from certain news sources. And they connect back to larger entities that, connect to corporations that are trying to sell you other products as well, and maintain a certain type of lifestyle in the market so that they can continue to profit. Okay, so the last second to last, we're going to look at climate change. I want you to look at the what is expected from the outfall of climate change, and in particular to weather and climate, because I want to show you the impacts on our society when we have these extreme climatic events. And are we really prepared? And are all people treated fairly in those situations? So what you're going to be watching is this video, and this is a little bit dry. It's not my favorite on Hurricane Katrina, but it's sufficient for what we need it for this class. It's about an hour and a half, and it cuts off at the end. But don't worry about that. Just watch the part that's there. My favorite is actually, I think it's called When the Levee Breaks. But it's 4 episodes, and each episode is an hour long. But if you're interested in learning more about Katrina beyond what is shown in this 1.5 hour video, then I highly suggest watching When the Levees Broke. It looks like parts 1 and 2 are available on YouTube, but if you want to watch the whole thing, it's on HBO. It's really well done. It's amazing. And it's also very disturbing. So learn about Hurricane Katrina and our disaster preparedness in the United States. I want a 1-page reflection, which can be included in all these questions. So just do number 2 and then write your page. And this is really like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this, or I'm not surprised. Excuse me. Really, it's just a free write. I just want to hear what you have to say. Next one,
links to this link. What is Katrina Diaspora? Here's the corporate education takeover I was talking about earlier. Why do we care about education when we're talking about environmental studies? Well, if you educate a population and you're giving them good information, then that creates a stronger, more knowledgeable society. That society contributes to voting and helps to create the world or our country that we live in. When we allow certain groups or organizations to have domination over our educational system, then we're actually giving a lot of power to people in positions of power that may be abusing it or using it for a certain reason to get what they want, which may not be what is best for everybody. They may think it's what's best for everybody, but there may be debates on that. Okay, and then you're going to watch, here I put, as if Katrina wasn't enough, the first half of another Vice that talks about the outfall of the BP oil spill. So I have some questions here for you. I'm asking you to do a little bit more research about the BP oil spill because the video kind of assumes that you already know a lot about it. Here's another one, first 15 minutes. Greenland is melting. It's all about the ice in Greenland melting and what's going on. And then it ties down here to the ocean conveyor belt. So I want you to connect these concepts. What you learn from Greenland is melting and what is the ocean conveyor belt? Why is that important and how are those two connected? The last part is kind of two videos. They're not long because they're pieces of a Democracy Now! Episode where Mark Jacobson, who is a professor and researcher at Stanford, who we have been able to have come to the Kirsch Center for speaker sessions, discusses along with one of his colleagues, I believe his name is Noah, the issue of global warming, what is happening, what do we expect. It ties into things like drought conditions, heavier storms. Droughts put pressure on agriculture. When we look outside the United States, we actually can see that there are connections to the immigration, the migration of individuals out of an area because they could no longer farm. They move into those urban areas. And then there are problems specifically in what we've seen in Syria with terrorism and issues that go along with that. So there's a lot of discussion in our current political environment about migration and putting up walls and borders and stuff like that. This will kind of give you an idea of how climate change is connected to that and what we should expect to see as we continue to see climate change influence our living conditions on Earth. So do the best that you can with that. Now, the last part, I'm giving you an hour and a half to do the final assessment and the student action plan. So the student action plan, just so you remember, is the paper. I went over that in another video, and it should be not the video. All the videos are on the YouTube site, but the PowerPoint or the PowerPoint presentation saved as a PDF is available right here, and it outlines all the different sections and what I expect from each of those sections in the paper. The final assessment is basically going back into, first I have a question about what you've learned in this class, tying it to the interdisciplinary nature of environmental science, environmental studies. So answer this in one submission, because the second part is going to be using your Google slides that you all generated, and they look amazing. Very impressed. To fill in, while that's opening, I'll go back into Canvas, this chart. Now, if you have a problem with accessing, where'd it go? Oh, it's opening it. Accessing the chart because it's in a Word document,
like I'm having. Why is it doing that? There it is. I had to put it in here like this because it was the only way it would fit. You can copy and paste it if you want into an Excel spreadsheet. It'll probably make it easier for you to navigate so that you can answer what's necessary. I couldn't fit them all on the Word document and have it fit on one page with the font set at a decent size, so I had to make it 6. So what I did is I just went into the Word document, copied it, and pasted it into Excel. This is how I would do it, and I believe you should be able to submit the Excel spreadsheet. If you cannot, then shoot me an email and I'll see if I can change the settings in Turnitin.com so that you can. What I want you to do is I want you to go through the awesome presentation that this is our group presentation because it's very difficult to do group work in an online environment, and fill in. So history, so we're on transportation. History of transportation. Let's see what our classmates had to say. History of transportation. You can read through it. I say one sentence in each one that you are able to fill out. If there's something missing, then just say NA. And that's acceptable because I can see what's in the presentation. So that won't impact you in grading wise if the information is not available. If you'd like to go beyond and look it up yourself to find something, then I would suggest that. That's what an A+ student would do. No, I don't give A+, but that's what an A student would do. When you're done with this, submit it into the folder. And I have 2 folders down here for your final assessment. This is the number 1 question and then the chart here. And that's it. There is no 3-2-1 for this week because the book that is available, or the book that is listed there, is the text that's available on campus for free. But since you all are in an online environment, I'm just going to X-nay that chapter. And so your work for this week is finish anything that you haven't done and submit your student action plan and your final and your work from this week, as well as any prior weeks where you might have not done anything, all needs to be submitted by August 8th at midnight. That's the last submission time, okay? So all work needs to be submitted by August 8th at midnight. And then I will be reviewing and grading it all, okay? I hope you have a good week. I'll probably send a follow-up after I've kind of looked at everything just to let you all know how I feel. But so far, I feel really great. I hope you have been enjoying this class. I hope it hasn't been too much of a downer. I hope that it has been an eye-opening experience. And I hope that you will continue to consider the impacts on the environment as well as our social impacts of our choices throughout the rest of your academic and professional careers. And if you have any questions, even after this class is over, feel free to email me. I would be happy to help give you direction if you're interested in further study in certain areas, or even if you just need support in completing your current academic goals. Okay, have a great week. Thanks.